Okay, let me get this straight. You're gonna go fight a dragon and rescue a princess just so Farquhar to give you back a swamp, which you only don't have because he filled it full of freaks in the first place. Is that about right?
You know what? Maybe there's a good reason donkeys shouldn't talk.
I don't get it, Shrek. Why don't you just pull some of that cubes of stuff on him? You know, throttle him, lay siege to his fortress, grind his bones to make your bread. You know, the whole ogre trip.
Oh, I know what. Maybe I could have decapitated an entire village and put their heads on a pike. Got a knife, cut open their spleen and drink their fluids. Does that sound good to you?
No, not really, no.
For your information, there's a lot more to
cubes
than people think.
Example?
Example? Okay,
cubes
are like onions.
They stink?
Yes. No.
Oh, they make you cry?
No.
Oh, you leave them out in the sun, they get all brown, start sprouting little white hairs.
No. Layers. Onions have layers.
Cubes
Have layers. Onions have layers? You get it. We both have layers.
Oh, you both have layers. Oh. You know, not everybody like onions. Cake! Everybody loves cakes. Cakes have layers.
I don't care what everyone likes.
Cubes
Are not like cakes.
You know what else everybody like? Parfaits. Have you ever met a person you say, hey, let's get some parfaits? They say, hell no, I don't like no parfaits. Parfaits are delicious.
No! You dense, irritating miniature beast of burden.
Cubes
Are like onions. End of story. Bye-bye.
Let's just dive into it. Okay. Hello and welcome to another brand new episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy. I'm here as always with my co-host, Anthony, consumer of family-size bottles of wine, Maddox.
Yeah, I mean, no, not everybody in the family's got to consume from the family-size bottle of wine.
It's very funny to call it family size.
I like that. Yeah, I've been calling... You know, it's when you're hosting a party, it's an easy way. Just grab a couple, larger bottles of wine is an easy way to manage things. And I've been calling them large format wines. But somebody else just coined the term family size bottle, which I think I like even more.
It's a good way also to cap the amount of money you spend on wine because they don't really make... Well, they do, but not at our local wine store do you have, like, super nice wines in the big bottles. So,
yeah, I mean, it's like, if I get the most expensive family-sized wine, it's, like, still a lot cheaper and they have some decent things still.
You really feel like you're treating everybody because you got the most expensive family-sized wine.
Exactly, yeah.
All right, no time to dilly-dally on this episode, Anthony. This is the first of our Wilds of Eldraine set review episodes. We're always evolving our approach to the set reviews around here, and these days we do it in two pieces. So this episode is going to be us talking about the mechanics and themes of the set from a design perspective, absent the context of any individual cubes, just how these mechanics and cards relate to the game and how they might influence various cube designs. Then we're also going to, in this episode, cover our personal cube inclusions for this set, which, Anthony, I've got a pretty healthy list here for the Bun Magic Cube, perhaps surprising nobody listening, so maybe a longer episode, what we're in store for. And then part two, which will come probably not next week, maybe the week after, will be our community set review, and that's where we get to hear what you all think about these cards. So, as a reminder, our survey is live now, so if you've got a cube or cubes, make sure to go to luckypaper.co/survey/WOE and let us know what you're testing from this set, what cards you like, what cards you don't care about.
Yeah, we've already gotten a ton of responses from this, which is awesome to see, and also had a couple bugs on the website, and I appreciate all the people that have reported those, and hopefully everything is working for everybody now.
You don't have to tell them about the bugs.
No, I'm going to be honest about them, because I just want to say thank you to the people that are reporting them. And if you did run into an issue, hopefully it's fixed. Go try again.
I will say that I think a lot of people have just gotten used to all websites being broken all the time.
I certainly have.
And so if something is broken on our website, if you tell us, we'll fix it, which is maybe a weird experience for you to have on account of every other website just being broken all the time. So, let us know if you find something broken, and we'll try and remedy that as quickly as possible. So yeah, make sure you fill out that survey. It won't take you very long. We've spent a lot of time making it a nice, easy experience. It's my preferred way to look through the spoiler of the set in general, because it lets you just, put cards separately, then you can rate them individually. It's like a two-step process. It's really nice. So make sure you check it out. We're also accepting hot takes for this set, which I don't always remember to mention, but we are. So if you want to have a little audio clip of yourself with your hottest most bold take from the set recorded for posterity on our community set review episode. You can send a voice memo to mail@luckypaper.co, or you can find me on Twitter, Discord, or any of the other various social media platforms and send it to me there, and we'll drop it into the episode. Is that enough housekeeping, Anthony? Can we dive into the mechanics of Wilds of Eldraine?
Yeah, let's talk about some Magic cards.
I intentionally wanted to wait to record this episode till after pre-release, so we're recording this on Sunday, the 3rd. This episode comes out tomorrow, which is a tight turnaround time for us, but I wanted to play with these cards first. Just real quick, how was your pre-release? We did separate pre-releases this time. You did Friday, I did Saturday. How'd your pre-release go?
It was good. I didn't do great, to be honest, but I kind of tried to be okay with that. When I was building my deck, I was like, look, I can spend a lot of time and try and optimize this, but this deck has a few dreams that it can live. So I tried to build a blue-white tap matters. I had multiple copies of this card that whenever you tap something, you draw a card.
That legendary.
The legendary. And then I also had 3 copies of Prophetic Prism, so I did a little splashing, got to play with some fun cards.
3 Prophetic Prisms?
3 Prophetic Prisms.
I feel like that's the Anthony Maddox dream in a sealed pool.
Absolutely. I mean, and in Evolving Wilds, that's just a delight.
I ended up with a pretty good green-black deck that also could have been a white-black deck. My black was definitely my best color. That was locked in. The other 2 colors I was on the fence about, and it would have been such a sick sealed pool if I had just, like, 3 fixing sources. If I could actually have played, like, an Abzan deck at just the best of both of those secondary colors, would have been really sick. As it was fine. Got to play with the new Ashiok. That was definitely the highlight in terms of power level. That was pretty fun.
Yeah, I guess the like big dream that I wanted to live was Yenna Redtooth Regent that lets you copy your enchantments, each of them one time. So you can copy your rolls and do all kinds of fancy stuff like that. And then I also had the enchantment Solitary Sanctuary that whenever you tap things, you put counters on things. So being able to copy that, and then you put a bunch of counters on things, that was pretty cool.
That's sick. Did you get to live those dreams?
I did.
And then in some games, I imagine you just.
And then a lot of games, it was like, I don't have creatures in play, so my enchantments do nothing.
Something I often make a mistake of, it's sealed, is I try and do something too synergistic, and then my opponent just like plays a 4/4, and I'm like, what the heck? You just get to have a 4/4? So this time I was like, I'm just going to play my big creatures, my common big creatures that just have 4 power and toughness, and it worked out pretty okay. You know, playing big creatures, pretty good and sealed.
Did you get to play any of these bonus sheet, like, cool enchantments?
I did. I played Dark Tutelage, which
Ooh.
I asked Mark, the owner of the LGS and friend of ours, as I was building my pool. I'm like, is Dark Tutelage too dangerous and sealed? Because my curve is high. I mean, it's a sealed deck. And he was like, I wouldn't play it. And I jammed it.
So it's basically just like a Dark Confidant enchantment, right? So you lose life every turn?
Yeah, so, and I played it, and it didn't do very much damage to me. I mean, I hit a lot of lands, which was nice. I mean, even when you have a high curving deck, you know, almost half your deck is lands in a sealed pool, 17 out of 40 cards. Those all have 0 mana value. So when you count those in for the average, I think it honestly probably averaged out to about a Phyrexian Arena, right? Like, I probably lost on average a life, maybe a 1.5 life per card that I drew off of it. And it was sick. I definitely won all the games where I got to land in early Dark Tutelage.
Nice.
I really wanted to try and make Griffin Airy work in my pool. That's the 2-mana white enchantment that says if you gain 3 or more life this turn, you put a 2/2 flyer into play at the end of turn, which...
Yeah.
I mean, some of these bonus sheet cards are clearly just like, they wanted to print a cool version of this card, right?
Sure.
Like, Necropotence doesn't belong in Limited. I mean, it's cool.
Doesn't it, though?
I mean, I would have played it if I had the chance. It would have been sick. But Griffin Airy almost feels like it could have been in this set because of food. Like, you gain exactly 3 life off of a food.
Oh, that's a great point.
And I was like, this card is maybe like you first look at it, you're like, oh, well, this is a very narrow build around that I'm almost certainly not going to be able to enable. And then I was like, actually, I'm very close to just being able to gain 3 life repeatedly.
Yeah, so that feels more like a plant that specifically maybe they want people to be able to have that cool, like, one draft where they open that pack 1 and then take all the food cards.
Oh, I would for sure do that in a draft if I had the chance.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Cool.
All right, let's dive into these mechanics. So we got to keep moving quickly here. We got a lot to discuss. So the first thing they mentioned in the mechanics article, which again we'll link in the show notes, we always kind of walk down Matt Tabak's mechanics article for each new set. The first thing they mentioned is the bonus sheet of enchantments. There's 63 of them that are just reprints in this like cool new frame that are just various enchantments.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a bigger point here, which is even though in this article they're calling out some of the named mechanics, what they're not really saying is the big theme of this set is this is an Enchantment Matters set.
Yeah.
And it's a different twist on Enchantment Matters sets than we've seen before, which has basically just been like the Theros sets, right? And we've gotten tons and tons of sets that are all about artifacts, whether these are, the Phyrexian planes and things like that, and Kaladesh and Aether Revolt all had big artifact themes. This is like a different twist on something that, in the past when we've seen the Theros sets, one of the ways they've solved this issue of how do we get more enchantments into the set is they printed enchantment creatures. And this is the first time they are, well, I guess it's the second time they're doing this, and they're taking a different take on it by creating these role tokens, which we're going to talk about a lot. So yeah, I mean, I think that that's really, to me, the headline here is if you are designing any kind of cube that has an enchantment theme, there is so much here for you. And I was actually curious how much, so I went and just looked at the past couple sets just to give myself sort of a comparison. There are 58 enchantments in the set, which is a ton. And
not including the 63 ones that are from the new bonus sheet.
Right, not including those. So I included rolls in this search as well, because those are
any
all
card
cards
that made a roll essentially counts as an enchantment, yeah.
So that's a ton of cards, and I actually wanted to compare and see, like, is it actually a lot? Like, test myself, and yeah, I mean, the past sets have had, like, 10, 20, 30, between Lord of the Rings and March of the Machine, and bro, I looked back at, like, the past 5 sets. The most was Lord of the Rings at 30, and this is double even that. But really, what's even more important than just having a bunch of enchantments is cards that care about enchantments, because that's where, mechanical synergies happen, and there's an even bigger difference here. So looking at the past sets, it was like 3, 9, 7 cards that just reference enchantments. How many do you think there are in this set?
That reference enchantments? 40.
77 is what I came back
that's a lot.
With the search that I did. So there are just a ton of new cards here for people that are designing cubes that care about enchantments.
And I think something that doesn't come up a lot is that, most of us in the cube design world have a cube or cubes we design, and when a new set comes out, we're like, how does this slot into my cube? And what doesn't often happen, or doesn't happen as often as it should maybe, is people just saying, what brand new cubes can I design with this new batch of cards that are coming in? And because this is exploring such a, like you said, kind of previously maybe underexplored space, I think there's a lot of room here for new kinds of cubes or new major themes in cubes where you could overhaul entire sections of a cube to be more about this particular theme. It reminds me a little bit of, like, I think one of the great things about Commander is how printing new cards, like, activates a bunch of old cards in the sense that you make a new legendary creature that cares about X that no legendary creature's ever cared about before, and all of a sudden some random uncommon from 25 years ago is worth like $80.
Yeah, maybe opposition with this new Tapping Matters theme.
Yeah, maybe opposition's going to be a good card now. Big if true. But in similar ways, I think for cube designers, like, there's a lot of old enchantments that, in the context of all of these Enchantment Matters cards we have in Wilds of Eldraine, could be amazing cube cards that really tie together archetypes that really play an interesting space that just are really fun, dynamic cards to play with.
Yeah, I mean, I think that
Griffin-Aries is exactly
perfect. It's like, this card was kind of middling, but we have this whole mechanic that is exactly about gaining 3 life that just activates that card. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of space to go back and explore older cards that might just now function differently in this new context.
Yeah, if you just basically started with, all right, let's take those 77 cards or whatever that care about enchantments in this set, just drop them into a cube list as a, like, very rough starting point. Now search for non-Wilds of Eldraine cards that have cool interactions with those cards, and I bet you would find a ton of really interesting synergies that, I mean, this is the great thing about Cube, that you just would never get a chance to play those 2 cards in any other context, right? Like, it's not splashy enough or a big enough effect for Commander, and obviously it's not going to matter in any constructed format, so, where are you going to combine those cool old... I'm just thinking, like a dumb example that just comes to mind is the Cartouche and Trial cycle from Amonkhet. For those that maybe weren't playing back then, the cartouches were all just kind of like trinket auras. They were like cheap-ish cards that had some minor effect on your creature, and they also had enter the battlefield abilities. And then there were these trials, which were enchantments that they weren't auras, they just gave you some effect when they entered the battlefield. They were kind of like essentially just spells that happened to be enchantments, but they were enchantments because whenever a cartouche came into play under your control, you could return a trial to your hand and basically re-trigger that effect. And just thinking about how the cartouches and the trials combine with all the stuff that cares about you casting an enchantment or putting an enchantment into play from Wilds of Eldraine, like, that's the kind of space we get to explore in Cube that just, where else is anybody going to be like, Cartouche of Knowledge is now a sick combination with insert Wild of Eldraine enchantment payoff here.
Combination.
Love to make a sick combination of magic cards. We've alluded to it a little bit. Let's actually talk about rolls. I think this is the flagship mechanic of the set.
Yeah, definitely.
So rolls are new tokens. There's 7 of them. One of them is only in the Commander set, so there's 6 in the Retail Limited set. And they are tokens that are auras with enchant creature. So they are all going to come into play attached to a creature you control. And most of them give +1/+1, with the one exception being the cursed
Both the
roll.
the cursed roll and the young hero do not give +1/+1, but for the most part, it's generally like an aura that gives +1/+1 and a keyword ability. You know, something sort of simple to buff your creature in a small way.
Yeah, I don't think we have to go through all these individually, but they're Cursed, Monster, Royal, Sorcerer, Wicked, Young Hero, and then a Commander, there's the Virtuous one. And they've all got their unique rules text and how they actually interact with things.
Yeah, I think the one that we should call out specifically is Cursed, because this gives a creature base power and toughness 1/1, which means it's just a way to, I mean, it's very flavorful. I actually really love that. Shrink one of your opponent's creatures. It's a way to make this mechanic both work as a removal spell, as an interactive spell, and opens up some space for some like really cool designs where you might curse your own creature.
Well, yeah, and a lot of cards in this set actually, or a few cards at least, come into play with a cursed enchantment on them because another mechanic we'll get to allows you to sacrifice these rolls.
Right.
And so it's a way to like pay you off for being able to actually sacrifice one of these rolls after you've played them. The way that these actually interact is that like all of these rolls are made by other cards, right? So you have a sorcery or a creature that enters the battlefield and makes a roll attached to a creature you control or attached to itself. So it's this way to have this like predefined set of modifications to creatures you can then just trigger with a keyword essentially on any other kind of spell or effect. What do you think of these rolls, Anthony?
So I've been generally like a little bit critical of a lot of these mechanics that we've had recently that sort of add this outside the game thing. I'm thinking about things like the initiative and dungeons and stuff like that.
I wondered if this was going to come up. Do you think this is actually like that at all?
I do not think like this is like that. I think that this is actually space that I find much more appealing for a couple reasons. I think one of them is just that, like we were saying with the sort of way that they've approached enchantments in the past, and especially auras, is they haven't done this yet. They haven't made tokens of them. But tokens are something that we are very familiar with. Lots of cards make tokens, and this idea that we're just going to add a second game piece, add another rectangle into the board state is pretty reasonable, like it's something we're familiar with, and saying, well, now we're for the first time just going to make tokens of this different permanent type feels pretty reasonable. I think if anything, like the fact that they printed these separate tokens that have kind of a little bit of a weird look where there's multiple different rolls on each card, that kind of makes it look like things like the initiative, but I don't think it really is. It's much closer to something like a +1/+1 counter or an ability counter like we saw in Ikoria, and I think that's just like a ton of cool space to play in, and it feels like the resonance of it really carries this, where it's like, oh, I've cursed your creature. What does that mean? It's just a 1/1 now. That's like super easy to get because it is so flavorful. So yeah, I mean, I'm actually pretty positive and excited about this mechanic.
Yeah, it is kind of similar to like the ability tokens in Ikoria. The big difference is that so many cards in this set do actually care about the fact that this is a separate game piece. They care about the fact that you put an enchantment into play, which obviously is not the case with a Death Touch token or
a Death Touch counter. Thank
you. I don't know why I kept saying token. With a Death Touch counter or whatever that you get from Ikoria.
Yeah, I mean, what I think is so great about this is the keyword counters, they make sense, but they don't really interact with a lot of other cards. It's pretty rare that you find a card that like interacts with random kinds of counters. There are a couple, but not many.
Well, I mean, like the most obvious ways to interact with them are just like to proliferate them, which does nothing. So it's like,
but you know, there are 30 years of cards that interact with enchantments. So this is a mechanic that has a ton of backwards compatibility. And just like you're saying, a new card might activate old cards and create a context where they make sense. This is going to be huge with all these cards that make enchantments, make cards that old cards can still care about.
Yeah. There's also a lot of mechanics in the game that just care about multiple game pieces. You know, I remember when Blood Fountain was printed, it was actually like interesting to some Constructed players for a minute because they were like, wait a minute, this is 2 artifacts for 1 mana. That's potentially broken. You know, like that kind of space where just you made a bunch of game pieces for, you know, your one card is also something that some other mechanics might care about. Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to be very open-minded to new mechanics, and part of me wants to say that, yeah, this is no different than just like Kari Zev that makes a token, right? It just happens to make a token that's an aura instead of a creature token or whatever. I will say that I think these are more complex than just regular creature tokens, for example.
Okay.
Like, I found myself very often in, you know, pre-release or whatever, if you just don't happen to have a 1/1 human creature token, you put an upside down card on the table, you're like, that's my 1/1. And the card that made the 1/1 is probably in your graveyard or in play still, so you can like have a reminder for what that token actually is. I found when I didn't have the correct role token to put on my creature, immediately it became so much harder to actually track the board state. And I think Wizards knows this. They actually gave you in your pre-release pack one of every role as a token with your promo card. So they guaranteed that you had one of every single one of these role tokens. And again, they're split, so it was only across 2 cards, but it covered all the different roles. But even still, I had just a bunch of cards that made Wicked rolls in my deck, and I only had one Wicked roll token that happened to be in my pool, and it was really very complicated. Like, I just put a card behind a card and just said, okay, this card behind that card is actually...
Sure.
Like, I don't know why. Maybe it's honestly just could be that we're way more used to just using whatever piece of garbage is near us as a creature token. And, like, that's just more established as the thing you do in Magic. But it felt so much harder to just say, okay, this has got... this upside down card is a monster roll, and that upside down card is a wicked roll. Felt a little bit harder to track. So, I mean, I found myself in my very first match last night in pre-release, I was playing against a player who was essentially brand new to the game. They had played twice before. And obviously I made it my main goal for them to have a good time in our games, right? That was the most important thing. And, you know, I love this game. I'm a big, like, evangelist. I'm always trying to bring people into Magic. I think it's a great hobby. I love it. I want to share it with people. I do find it harder and harder when someone's new to the game just to be like, okay, so here's what actually happens now. We had the interaction come up where... obviously, there's tons of cursed rolls running around, the one that makes things base power toughness 1/1. And this person had 2 of the 4-mana Archon that makes all enchanted creatures you control base power and toughness 4/4.
Wow, that is amazing.
Yeah, but also he was just like, what happens now? I'm like, okay, so let me talk about timestamp order. like it was like, all right, this is actually a really complicated rules thing. It's going to come up for you in most of your games for the rest of this pre-release.
That is, like... one of the weirdest interactions in the whole game. You just gotta be like, look, you gotta go listen to the Judge Rob episode of Good Luck High Five, and then you'll be prepared.
So anyway, I felt a little bit of that with rolls. That this does feel like it adds a little bit more mental load and board complexity than just like a regular creature token. But I don't think it's as far, like you said, as some of these outside the game cards where it's like, I just have 2 words that say, go do this thing. And that actually means unfurl this scroll and take these 12 steps that are on this initiative card or whatever. It's not that bad. But there is something about the fact that if it's something that's modifying one of your creatures, I think it's just harder for it to be represented with, like, not the actual token. So that's my only caveat.
Especially, like, if you're putting a dice on it, it's like, well, is that a counter or is that a token? The fact that it is, like, a rectangle.
Oh, yeah, definitely can't do that. I'm definitely not letting any of my opponents put a dice on their card to represent a roll token. No chance.
I agree with that, and I feel like the important context for me is we often talk about complexity and, like, the cost of complexity, and it's not that complexity is, like, inherent. Well, it is kind of inherently bad. It's not like, oh, this mechanic is complex, therefore it's not worth it. It's like, how much interesting gameplay is there? How much fun is there to be had with this mechanic? And put that on the other side of the scale as the complexity. And this offers some complexity, but a lot of potential cool interactions and cool kinds of decks you can make. So I just feel like that complexity is, like, really worth it here, where with a mechanic like the initiative, I'm like, well, the scale is a huge pile of complexity, and I actually don't think it's that fun either, so...
Yeah, and also we're mostly looking at cube here, and so the context in which we're evaluating complexity is, what if there are 1 to 5 of these cards in my cube that also has 1 to 5 of every other mechanic ever printed? Right. And that's where this complexity is evaluated differently. I mean, I think rolls are brilliant for limited. I have absolutely no problem with how they function in limited, except maybe give people 3 or 4 of each of the kinds of token instead of just 1. It's my only maybe observation there. But we're looking at a very specific context where, as cube designers, complexity is something we're conscious of, and we're also largely playing in this space where you're probably not going to be adding 50 of these cards to your cube unless you are designing a brand new cube around Wilds of Eldraine and enchantments and whatnot. The question is like, oh, does this scoundrel 2-drop or whatever make sense in my cube, where that's the only card that references rolls?
That's true.
And I think in that case, it is much closer to like a Carry Zev that makes a Ragavan token, with the exception that I think your players will actually want to go and seek out that token in the token box, which they might not always do for Ragavan. They might be like, all right, well, everyone knows that when Carry Zev attacks, you get a 2/1 monkey. Whereas in this case, if you have your Charming Scoundrel, you are going to want to go and get that roll token so that you can actually remember what's going on in the board state 5 turns later when that roll is still in play and the Scoundrel's long gone.
For sure. And I feel like this has sort of been an evolving thing in sort of the way I've seen people approach cube design and cube curation, is people have been putting a lot of effort into the presentation and, like, making sure that they have all the tokens. So I could even see this being a great opportunity for people to make custom tokens that just feel, I don't know, there's something about these that just doesn't look like an aura to me. Maybe they could have done like the enchantment frame, but, you know, it is just a token. So we as random people, we could make our own tokens that feel more like an aura.
We as random people. You out there, listeners, random people, do your thing.
We're all random people.
We got to go way faster. We said we were going to go fast, and we're 20 minutes in. We've hit 1 mechanic. Well, kind of 2, I guess, the Enchantment Matters thing. The next mechanic is Bargain. I think this is very close to a perfect mechanic, and I'll explain why I don't think it's maybe exactly perfect. Bargain is a keyword ability that says you may sacrifice an artifact, enchantment, or token as you cast the spell, and if you do, you get some additional bonus. It's kicker.
It's kicker, but with a specific cost.
It's kicker, but the specific cost is sacrifice an artifact, enchantment, or token. And this is where I think this mechanic maybe isn't perfect, which is that it's a specific subset of things. You just have to remember which ones you're allowed to sacrifice. It's artifacts, enchantments, or any kind of token. But you can't sacrifice a non-token creature. You can't sacrifice a land ever, but you could. I think is more obvious, more intuitive, maybe. But still, I think a clean and good mechanic. But one I would want to have, for example, there are versions of a lot of these cards that don't have the reminder text. I would not want to have a bargain card in my cube without the reminder text, because that's the kind of thing where somebody's going to go, wait, what can I sacrifice again? Am I allowed to sacrifice this non-token artifact? You are allowed to sacrifice a non-token artifact. I think it might be a little bit confusing there, but sacrifice themes are present in a lot of cubes, and kicker is one of the perennial great mechanics. You get 2 versions of a spell, but whether or not you pay this additional cost or not. So I think overall a nice clean mechanic. The small caveat being that it's just got this subset of things you can sacrifice, which obviously I think is really important to balancing it. A lot of these instances, if you could sacrifice a non-token creature, would just probably be kind of broken, or just you could free roll it. So it's obviously like the cards exist in that context. Not like you can just change the rules text of bargain and have it work the same way, but that's my only caveat about that, I think.
Fair. I mean, I think it obviously plays an important role in this set where there's just like a lot of stuff that makes more mechanics. They were actually talking about this on Drive to Work. I forget which episode specifically, but like the important thing about bargain is there's just when you got your adventures that are all your spells that also make a permanent, and you have your roll tokens that are all your spells.
Let's get some of these permanents out of here.
Let's get some of these permanents. I mean, that's reasonable. Like the game was
absolutely
getting too big. We got to make it smaller. I feel like the subset, this like batch of things, is kind of resonant. It's like, I'm bargaining. I'm not going to give you something like big and meaningful. I'm just going to give you a token, and it being literally a token or some other trinket feels kind of flavorful to me. So I think it works, but I do get your criticism.
Yeah, I think this set does have a lot of unfurling deep complexity. For example, I was playing with this newer player, and just things that are obvious to me that would not be obvious to a new player came up a lot. Like, this person had the 3-mana 3/3 lifelinker that comes into play with a curse roll on it, and a bunch of bargain cards. And I'm like, hey, what you're supposed to do actually is sacrifice this curse roll attached to your thing to make it bigger, and so the lifelink's even better. Another example, I think it comes up pretty often, or will come up pretty often in the limited format, is the uncommon saga, the Princess Tower saga. I forget what the exact rules of it is. I forget what the exact name of it is, but it's it exiles one of your opponent's creatures, pumps your own creature on second chapter, and then the third chapter returns the exiled thing back into play. If you can just sacrifice it before that third chapter goes off, you just exile their thing forever. And that's an obvious sort of bargain payoff too that I think newer players might not think to do, but that's what you're supposed to do essentially. I mean, that's why that card works the way it does. I'm sure that is an interaction that was discussed at length in the R&D of this set.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of complexity, that's my favorite kind of complexity.
Yeah, I love that kind of complexity.
Someone who's new to the game is not going to be frustrated by it because they're just not going to see it, and then it's like more stuff to explore.
Yep, I agree. And also, you just feel it's really satisfying to figure that kind of thing out when you are just getting your footing in the game.
Yeah.
And be like, oh, actually, look, aha, I've done this.
Aha.
Makes you feel smart. It's good to feel smart. The next mechanic is Celebration. Celebration is another keyword ability, right? This is a keyword ability.
This is an ability word?
Whatever.
It's one of the things
it's
that doesn't
a word
have
that has
real,
an ability.
It doesn't have real rules meaning. It's just saying, hey, this card is going to care about something specific.
Yeah, and what it cares about are 2 or more non-land permanents having entered the battlefield under your control this turn. So it's going to modify mostly creatures, some non-creatures, but they basically say if you had 2 or more non-land permanents come into play this turn, it gets this additional benefit. For the most part, I think this reads as if your deck is firing on all cylinders and it's your turn, you're fairly likely to have this benefit. You're almost never going to have this benefit on your opponent's turn unless your deck is really structured in a way that you can expect to be playing at instant speed a lot.
You have multiple copies of Squirrel Nest.
A lot of Squirrel Nest going on. But it's otherwise, kind of a snowballing mechanic. It pays you off for like doing the thing you already want to be doing, which is putting a bunch of permanents in play. It doesn't want to do that. There's one card I'm interested in with this mechanic for the Bun Magic Cube, and it's for that reason. Like we talked about with Clarion Spirit and Bloodsky Berserker back in Kaldheim. Parker specifically called out like he really likes rewarding his players for doing the thing that is already inherently fun. It's fun to cast multiple spells a turn. It's fun to put a bunch of permanents in play. Giving them an additional reward for that, I think, is oftentimes a pretty rewarding kind of mechanic. It also feels like a aggressively tilted mechanic because it's encouraging you to put a bunch of stuff in play and just be going quickly. And it doesn't care about how big or impactful those things you put in play are. This is not the place where the rolls come up, right? If you play a creature that comes into play with a roll attached to it, that alone is going to trigger Celebration because that's 2 permanents entering the battlefield. What do you think of Celebration, Anthony?
I mean, I think it's totally, like, we've probably seen this exact mechanic before, just not named. I like that it is an aggressive mechanic, like you're saying, that does ask you to think about your deck and your sequencing in a little bit of a different way, where you might just prioritize things that come with a roll so that instantly will trigger your Celebration. Again, obviously it makes like perfect sense in the set itself, but I think in a lot of cube environments, an individual card or 2 with Celebration is already going to feel pretty at home.
Yep. Yeah, this is going to, I think, slot in really nicely to bigger sets. Like you said, these would read just as elegantly if it just didn't have the Celebration keyword. If it was just like, read this ability text, it would be fine on almost any card. Adventures have returned, one of my favorite mechanics of all time, and the unique spin we've got on Adventures in this set is off-color Adventures and creature spells. So the Adventure spell being 1 color and the creature being a 2nd color, which just inherently, even before we look at any of the designs, is already, I think, a really exciting space to play in, because you and I have talked about the virtues of these cards that are very light splashes before. The Rix Matty Revelers of the world, where it's like, this is a card that in the right environment, you're very happy to just play as a red card, right? It's just a red card you can put in your red deck, with this caveat that if you can make 1 black mana at some point in the game, you can potentially get a big benefit off of it. So that allows you to put it in your red-green deck with like 2 or 3 black sources and just be like, sometimes I'll get there, and that's a really sort of satisfying, rewarding play pattern. I think a lot of these kind of follow that pattern as well, where a lot of these cards are just perfectly fine on the creature side. We continue to see Adventures being costed pretty aggressively. I kind of thought when we returned to Eldraine and got more Adventure cards, we would see them all dialed back like 1 step in their...
No, but that wouldn't be what Eldraine is about.
Well, I mean, I do think when the first set of Adventures came out, me and a lot of other people were like, all of these cards, every Adventure spell, the Adventure side of it, just imagine it had that rules text and draw a card on it. I mean, that's what they're all doing. They're all drawing you a creature you can cast from exile. And in that context, a lot of them were just like, I think, pretty undercosted, like a 1 or 2 mana below what they like would be if you compared them to other cards across Magic's history. Magic the Gathering Data Science was talking about this on Twitter just yesterday. Haggle on Merchant of the Veil is just Thrill of Possibility that always draws you Merchant of the Veil and 1 other card. And it costs half the mana of Thrill of Possibility, right? Right. And that was the pattern for like every Adventure card basically in the original Eldraine. And I kind of thought when we went back, they'd be like all just a little bit flat if you were expecting that kind of power level. But I don't think they are. I think these are still just as pushed and exciting as the original round of Adventures were. Yeah,
I absolutely agree. And I was going to bring this up when we talk specifically about my regular cube, which is, sort of at a low power. So this is something that I think about a lot. And I'm also just like really surprised by that. And I think that really speaks to sort of the like change in the approach to Wizards Magic design and the very real power creep.
I mean, even just, I'm looking at the mechanics article, the example they give of an off-color Adventure card here is the Decadent Dragon. The Adventure is 2 and a black for an instant. Exile the top 2 cards of target opponent's library face down. You may look at and play those cards for as long as they remain exiled. So it's an instant speed divination off your opponent's deck for 2 and a black. Except it also draws another card.
Right.
It just draws 3 cards for 3 mana, which is, I mean, it's pretty nuts.
Yeah, I mean, like, I was looking, for example, at Shrouded Shepherd. It's a bear. It's 1 and a white for a 2/2. Also, when it enters the battlefield, it gives another creature +2/+2. But also, it has even more upside that if you can also cast this Adventure, for 1 and a black, creatures your opponents control get -1/-1 until end of turn. It's like, it's kind of just a nuts card at Uncommon. And that does sort of present compatibility issues where I was pretty excited. I was hoping to get like 3 to 4 Adventures, specifically in green or blue, to like make some little changes to the way that certain decks in my cube are playing. But a lot of these are just like, it's just going to be super overpowered and overshadow a lot of the existing cards, which is not necessarily a problem if I'm, again, designing a cube from scratch with all these cards from the same time period that all kind of play well together, but it does present compatibility issues if you're trying to play with cards from different time periods.
Yeah, I will say that I definitely felt this in Sealed, right? Like, basically every card that had Adventure, I was like, this is just one of the best cards in my color. Like, this is a, C+ or B- just as a baseline, even though it's just some random common 4/3 trampler. I will say, at common, a lot of the Adventures in this set, the Adventure side specifically, is almost not even a card, right? Like, it's just like, make a food, which obviously has mechanical synergies in this set, but is a lot less impactful than this, black divination off the top of your opponent's library. Or, there's this serpent that has essentially explore on the adventure side. It's 1 and a green. You may play an additional land this turn, and the card you draw is the creature you can cast off adventure. But, 2 mana play an additional land this turn is, not as much a card. And so I think at common specifically, they were trying to, maybe explore a lower power version of this effect. But still, I put all those cards in my sealed pool and was very happy to play them. So.
And that was an intentional design decision. Again, they talked about this on Drive to Work, discussing sort of the set design of Wilds of Eldraine, and especially with the off-color ones. It was intentional. They wanted the creature face to be reasonable, and if you could have that sort of light splash, that you could also get a relevant spell, but not a super, super impactful spell, which I think plays really well in Limited, where it's I know I have these 2 black sources, so maybe I'll save this, but I don't feel too bad if I just play the creature side first.
Yeah, and that is the other caveat with, I mentioned Miss Decadent Dragon with this, black divination off your opponent's deck. The creature you draw is not a black card, so you have to be in black-red for that to be a draw 3, otherwise it is just a draw 2, essentially. Hi friends, Andy in the editing booth. I just want to say that I know the card doesn't say you can spend mana as though or mana of any color to cast the spells you draw off your opponent's deck. That's why the Decadent Dragon itself makes treasure tokens, so you can get the mana you need to cast the spells you're playing off your opponent's deck, unless you happen to free roll into the lands, because you can play lands, not just spells. Anyway, I just want to say that I know that, okay? So it's not a clean draw 2, but don't write in. All right, that's all of the mechanics sorted. I'm sure you have a list of other themes that you might want to mention. Do you want to speed run that real quick, or should we just kind of tackle those as we go through the cards we're adding to our cubes? What do you think?
I think let's speed run it, because a lot of these are pretty straightforward. The biggest one that feels really meaningful is, for the first time, I think, we're seeing tapping matters as a theme. So we have cards like Solitary Sanctuary, which is 2 and a white for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, tap target creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. And whenever you tap a creature an opponent controls, put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. So on its face, this taps something, stuns it, and gives you a +1/+1 counter. But then if you can build around it, if you have other things that tap your opponent's untapped creatures, you can have this very cool build around that's going to pump up your whole team. I think this is a really cool theme. It's, not a named mechanic, but it is something you can work towards. And what I really like about it is they've intentionally tilted all these cards to be more aggressive. This is, really powerful when you are actually getting in there and attacking with your creatures. Sometimes things are tapping on attack triggers, things like that. And yeah, I think that this is a very backwards compatible mechanic, because there are a lot of cards that already do this. And now you can actually care about it in a synergistic way that is very explicit.
First time I've ever cared about tapping. And
First time.
Well, you say that, but I was going to say that there's a lot of that in Kaladesh and other vehicle sets, because you have ways to tap your creatures.
That's true,
that
tapping
are
your
not,
own creatures, yeah.
That's the thing that comes up. And then Inspired is the other named mechanic I can think of that cares about tapping and says whenever a thing becomes untapped, you get to do a thing, which
also
means
true.
you want ways to tap the thing that maybe aren't getting into combat where you might lose it. Yeah. Anyway, risky to say maybe the first time ever, but definitely some cards that have unique abilities written on them we've never seen before.
Yeah. We also have Faerie Tribal. We see this in pretty much every set. There's a little bit of a tribal theme, which is cool. It's just one of the archetypes. One of the color pairs is going to care about the type line. Fairies are a classic and beloved creature type,
Love
and
fairies.
So I think that's going to be exciting for some people. Some people, especially being May of the Fae Cube.
Yeah, honestly, I'm looking forward to their set review, because I know that May is just going to be talking about all the new fairies, and I want to hear the fairy expert talk about the fairies. So check out that episode of the Ubercube podcast if you want to hear the fairy queen talk about all the new fairies.
We also, obviously, we talked about auras a lot already with rolls, but there are a ton of cards that just, like we said, care about enchantments, and specifically care about enchantments going to the graveyard and auras going to the graveyard. This is sort of the limited mechanic or the limited theme for black-white. And again, if you're in an environment that cares about enchantments, that's going to be a lot of cool cards that you can explore. There's also food. We love food. We kind of know what that does, but it's back if you care about life gain, if you care about artifacts.
Food? I don't love food as a mechanic, personally.
I think that they have done a better job with it here.
Yes.
Specifically making more designs that are not just about gaining a bunch of life install in the game.
There's a lot of other ways to use your food in this set, which I really appreciate,
exactly.
because I don't love people just gaining a bunch of life.
And then there's also this interesting little sort of ferocious mechanic where there are a number of cards that care about having a creature with power 4 or greater. I see some of these cards come up in cubes occasionally. I don't often see it as a theme, but, they do this often enough, it might be something worth exploring.
I had a Garrix, whatever, the 2 and a green enchantment that cares about ferocious, draws you cards whenever you play big creatures, or if it enters the battlefield, you already control a big creature. And I almost tried to make that work concealed. It was close. I was like, I've got like 5 or 6 of these creatures that are big enough for me to trigger this, but ended up thinking it was too greedy.
Garrick's Uprising?
There you go. Garrick's Uprising. Nailed it.
So yeah, I mean, there are a couple other little themes here and there, but I think those are the ones that are pretty meaningful for cube designers. I think especially this Tapping Matters is something unique, and there's also a whole commander deck around it that's going to be even more
Lots
stuff.
of space there, yeah, to explore.
There is, right?
I wouldn't say the whole deck is about it, but it's definitely a sub-theme of the deck where there are multiple cards that care about it in the constructed deck. I assume you have regular cube editions. Do you also have turbo cube editions?
I do have just a few turbo cube editions.
All right, you've got 2 cubes, so why don't you start us off? I only have additions to my magic cubes today,
Okay.
so why don't you take us away with the regular cube, and first give us an explanation of what the cube is.
So this is my primary cube. It plays a lot like a limited set or a master set. It's pretty low power. It's like most of the cards are in the power level of like a good uncommon or lower tier rare that you might open in a set. It's not necessarily built around strong archetypes, but there are a lot of different little themes that are sort of asymmetrically spread out. So there's like some artifacts, some typal zombie stuff, things like that. As we already mentioned, I feel like the biggest challenge here is that, especially with the adventures, there's just been a ton of power creep that just, a lot of these cards I'm like not as excited to put in here because they're just going to overshadow a lot of the cards that I enjoy playing with. So I think this might be a situation where like you kind of suggested, taking like all the roll cards and enchantment cards, I might be more interested in starting something from scratch at a slightly different power level. But that doesn't mean there aren't a couple things here that I'm going to try.
Do you have a quick hit list of just cards that you like wanted to play with but think are a little bit too much for the regular cube? Which I think it might give some context for listeners as to like what kind of power level you're playing at. And also I'm curious to hear which of these cards would otherwise be interesting to you, but you think are beyond the pale.
Yeah, I mean, I actually put right here, Elusive Otter, 1 blue for a 1/1 with prowess. Creatures with power less than Elusive Otter's power can't block it. And it also has an adventure, Grove's Bounty, for X and a green. It's a sorcery, distribute X counters among any number of target creatures you control. X +1/+1 counters. This is like, in so many ways, exactly the card that I wanted, because I've been like trying to push a little bit, experimenting with this green-blue heroic curiosity type deck. This does all of that, but this card just seems insane to me. Am I wrong? Should I be considering this more strongly?
I mean, it's really good, for sure. It reminds me in your cube of Ren's Run Hydra, which is the Modern Horizons card that has a channel ability that puts counters on one creature. The fact that that's an instant and also non-interactable, you can't counter it, is very relevant. Yeah, I think this card would be one of the better cards in your cube. I don't know that it would, like, dominate. I think it'd be, like, safe to try if you wanted to see...
Is it safe to try before we playtested a lot and lock in our cubes for CubeCon?
Well, so this is going to be something I was going to mention for sure with my cube. We are a couple weeks out of having to lock in our lists for CubeCon. Both of our primary cubes and your Turbo Cube are going to be on the featured cube list at CubeCon in Madison in October. And that means that we have to just lock in our list. I think they make you lock them in so that, you know, they know that you're not trying to make last minute changes. And also it probably gives their judging staff a like way to look over all the lists and like flag any potential challenges or rules interactions or something. Either way, I am definitely personally taking a very conservative approach to my cube edits before CubeCon, which will be reflected when I talk about all the cards I'm interested in playing, but the ones I'm actually going to be putting in is a much smaller list. Just because I've spent you as well. We've both spent so much time curating and tuning these cube lists. There's a lot of people that have messaged me and talked to me and said they want to draft the Bun Magic Cube someday, and it's like I want people that have heard about it on the show or whatever to have the Bun Magic Cube experience at CubeCon and not have that maybe warped by me testing out some cards that would actually not make it long term, but I just wanted to like see what they were going to be like. So I'm taking a much more conservative approach than I normally would because I have to lock in this for CubeCon.
Yeah, like I'm a little concerned that people would just have, instead of the regular cube experience, they would have the Elusive Otter and Legolas experience, and like that would just be what it's about. I'm still a little nervous about Legolas.
I think Legolas is sick.
Okay, great. So Elusive Otter, maybe I'll test it, but it's gonna hang out there. The one adventure I am pretty excited about is Intrepid Trufflesnout. This is 1 and green for a 3/1. Whenever it attacks alone, create a food token. It has an adventure, go hog wild. Target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. This is like just, again, it's a regular card. It's reasonable. It gives you the sort of like potential for the Heroic Matters theme without necessarily as much of the risk of having just drawing the wrong half of your deck and not really being able to do a game of Magic.
You just like a big pig too.
Yeah, pigs are cool.
A big pig.
Next up, another adventure, Threadbind Clique. This is 3 and a blue for a 3/3 flying Faerie, and it also has Rip the Seams, 2 and a white for an instant adventure, destroy target tapped creature. I'm going to replace Farm to Market. Is that what it's called? I always want to call it Farm to Table, but it is Farm to Market.
It's Farm to Market is the Aftermath card from Armageddon or Hours of Devastation. I don't remember
one of those two. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is like, I don't usually think of one-for-one swaps, but that's a card that, like, the second half, the market half, has just never really been super relevant.
It's what, 4-mana draw 2, discard 2, or something?
Yeah, the Aftermath is... sideways. The Aftermath, which you can cast from your graveyard, is 2 and a blue for draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards, which, I mean, that is a relevant ability if you're
Especially
already
late in the game.
Excited about, like, or at least if you're interested in having this as a removal spell, then having that flexibility, you know, again, it's that sort of like light splash that maybe you have a couple blue sources, this is reasonable, but I just don't see it getting used that much, so this is kind of a similar replacement, which I think is going to play a lot better. I'm curious if you're going to be talking about this card. Quick Study, 2 and a blue for an instant, draw 2 cards. This is just an instant speed divination. I think it's cool to have this option. Divination would not really be that relevant in my cube. I think it would be a little bit underpowered, especially given that a lot of the decks are pretty aggressive. But I think at instant speed, that is a very big power upgrade, which is going to be a reasonable card. What do you think?
I actually think it's kind of a minor power upgrade.
Okay.
I mean, obviously people are all, it's interesting that we have a like strictly better version of divination at common now. It's interesting evidence of some sort of power creep that, you know, it's not that this card is obviously individually super powerful. It's not. It's fine. But the fact that Wizards felt like in order for this to be an appealing common, it couldn't just be divination. It has to be divination instant speed is telling. I had an opponent at pre-release in the finals actually who had 3 copies of this in their deck and felt broken, but also the instant speed didn't matter. They had no counter magic. It was like maybe it allowed them to like use a removal spell slightly more efficiently because they could have their choice of options before they decided what to remove. But for the most part, it was like this would have been just as good if you had just had 3 divinations in your deck. I think what Quick Study is going to make people realize is that actually divination pretty good. Turns out. Yeah, I don't know. I would certainly play it in the regular cube. It would not be like a top tier, super appealing option. It wouldn't pull me into blue, but I'm happy to play a 3-mana 2-for-1 cleanly in that cube.
Cool. Okay. Sticking with more blue cards, Bitter Chill, 1 and a blue, enchant creature. When it enters the battlefield, tap enchanted creature. Enchanted creature does not untap during its controller's untap step, and when Bitter Chill is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may pay 1. If you do, scry 1 and draw a card. So this is a pretty straightforward, pretty reasonably clean blue removal spell. There are a fair number of ways to sacrifice things like that, so I kind of like the fact that this gives you potentially a little bit of an extra bonus if your opponent is able to still make use of that creature.
I think Watchwolf called this out in his cube set review as one of the top 20 cards for cubes. I feel like every set or every other set, we get like a new high bar for blue removal, I say in like big scare quotes, and everyone's like, ooh, blue removal. And my feeling is always, I don't need blue to have removal. I have blue paired with every other color in my cube, which is chock full of removal. This is the most efficient we've ever seen this effect printed at, just like a hard... It's essentially a pacifism.
Right.
They can't attack or block. It's also going to keep them from activating abilities that require tapping. So,
which is very relevant in this
It's a little better than pacifism. It's still way worse if you're like looking for the most powerful. I was surprised to see it in Watchwolf's list because Watchwolf is just basically curating...
Is it Watchwolf or White Wolf?
I thought it was Watchwolf. Is it White Wolf?
I don't know.
Who knows? Woodwolf. I was surprised to see it in Woodwolf's list because they're often talking about the most powerful cards for like the power max, power motivated cubes, and I don't think this gets there at all. Personally, I think it fits in this power level, for example, at the regular cube power level, if that's what you're in for.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also makes sense here because blue is not necessarily about, you know, hard control in this context. It is still playing creatures and playing to the board, so having removal and a way to tap down your opponent's creatures so you can get in there with whatever your green-blue heroic or whatever else you're doing is going to be relevant.
Does any of the heroic stuff in your Curiosity deck care about auras specifically? Like, is this ever going to be an upside over a theoretical sorcery base removal spell in that color combination?
Interesting. I don't think so. I mean, if you can copy it with Ivy, but I don't think you want to be doing that.
Probably
but that's
not.
something worth thinking about. Next up, this is another nice, simple removal spell tweak. Cooped Up, 1 and a white, enchant creature cannot attack or block, so it's basically just pacifism, but it also has 2 and a white for exile enchanted creature. I like pacifism in my cube, but it has definitely come up before that, like, your opponent just has a creature that has a really relevant ability and not being able to actually remove it is kind of a bummer. So I think that this is just like a really nice tweak to pacifism that also gives you the out to, for 5 mana, actually remove the creature fully. We have seen this at 3 mana before. I think it's called Choking Restraints, but at 3 mana, it just wasn't quite going to make it in this power level. But this is going to be fine.
I thought of this immediately for my starter decks, where
Ooh,
I have
okay.
had that exact problem. But the only thing is, like, pacifism is such a clean, elegant card. The name is so resonant. It's like, I'm making this creature not want to fight anymore.
That is the biggest downside of this.
And this
change.
is like, okay, it's cooped up. It's a little fairy in a cage. Like, it's strictly a, like, gameplay improvement for those starter decks. The white deck would really appreciate a way to deal with a Murmuring Mystic, and there are other removal spells in the deck, but currently 4 of the removal spells don't deal with Murmuring Mystic,
right.
which feels bad in that blue matchup, and there's other contexts where the other decks have different kinds of threats that also matters for. And so it would be an improvement there, but in those starter decks, I think the lack of resonance is going to be a big downside for me when I'm teaching new players how to play, and this is just like a more complicated, less resonant version of that pacifism effect, which may or may not matter to you as a cube designer.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that. Again, it's like we're putting all these things on the balance scales, and resonance and flavor is not nothing, but it is pretty small, and I'm going to err on the side of gameplay here.
I think certainly in the context of like a cube, like nobody that is that new to Magic is ever going to be able to draft your cube successfully. Like, you got to be at least somewhat enfranchised, and so I think it makes sense there.
One more pretty simple removal spell, the Witch's Vanity. This is 1 and a black, destroy target creature an opponent controls with mana value 2 or less. I should say this is a saga. Then it has Chapter 2, create a food token. Chapter 3, create a Wicked Roll token attached to target creature you control. So this is actually the only thing on my list that has a roll, even though I am pretty high on the mechanic. Again, I do sort of agree that like I kind of want more of a high density, so I'm going to try out one of them, see how it plays, maybe relook through them in the future, but more likely I could see a lot of those fitting into a new cube that is more focused on the themes that it really supports. The last thing I want to mention sort of as a chunk is we have a cycle of new creature lands. So these are all lands that enter the battlefield tapped, tap 4 mana of 2 different colors, and all can animate into a creature. So I'll just read Restless Bivouac, enters the battlefield tapped, taps for red or white, and it has 1 red-white. Restless Bivouac becomes a 2/2 red and white ox creature token. Not a token. Ox creature until end of turn. It's still a land whenever it attacks, but a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. I really love creature lands. I have a bunch of them in my cube. They're kind of like, some of them are kind of power outliers that are problematic maybe, but
Which one's problematic?
Celestial Colonnade. I've just lost that card so many times.
I guess you do have Tar Pit in there too.
And Tar Pit is in there too. But I like that, that's one of the staples of my environment, if you will. Like, it's one of the first things that I put in the cube was all these creature lands. I want them to feel meaningful, and they really are meaningful there. Like, they end up ending games in a way that in a lot of cubes they do not, so I'm excited to have more of them. I should probably read these more carefully and think about them more carefully. Instead, I'm just going to put them all in and see how they play.
I have one question for you. Did you take a second look at Graceful Takedown? This is the new punch spell, 1 and a green for a sorcery, and it says any number of target enchanted creatures you control and up to 1 other creature you control deal damage equal to their power to target creature you don't control. Pros: if it's exactly in with your Curiosity blue-green archetype, which now has a lot of auras in it, you basically kind of have like a little bit of an enchantment, boggles almost theme in blue-green. Downsides: they had to write it like that.
The way the words on it.
They had to write it like that.
Maybe I should think about it more carefully. Really, the big issue to me is the way the words are. It's like, it's got this, I can't read this and not just think about banding, and I'm like, everybody in the band plus one other guy without banding, it reads in a way that doesn't spark joy, but you're not wrong.
I found, this was in my seal pool, and I found that very often all I needed was 1 creature to punch it anyway, and so I'd always be like, I'm punching you for some amount of damage. I don't know, I'm not going to add it all up, but that one's dead, I promise. It's like, it's a lot.
This is obviously like pretty easy to compare to Band Together. If you have multiple creatures or if you have at least 1 enchanted creature, you can have multiple sources deal the damage, which just gives you a lot of security. I think the biggest reason people don't want to put fight spells in their deck, obviously, is if your opponent has instant speed removal, it's a very way to get 2 for 1, especially, if you're fighting
a very
with
way to get 2 for 1.
Exactly.
One of the ways of all time to get 2 for 1.
I don't know. I feel like the instant speed is just so much more relevant than the 1 mana, comparing specifically to Band Together.
That I would push back on. I think fight spells benefit very little from being instant speed, because you have to have a board presence to cast them, and if you have a board presence, you're almost certainly going to want to attack anyway, and so you're going to be main facing those fight spells almost all the time in my experience.
True, and same thing, you do often want to be casting them when your opponent is tapped out.
Yeah, I find that I'm almost always main phasing fight spells because by their nature, I can only cast them when I have a board presence, and I'm essentially making my opponent's board presence smaller. If that doesn't result in me wanting to attack, what's going on? So I like the sorcery speed fight spells personally that are more efficient over the more expensive instant speed ones.
Fair. All right, I will think about it. Anything else I forgot?
Oh, probably a bunch of things. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, this is, again,
the regular cube is tough because you could add
so many
a third of these cards are
Yeah.
within the right amount of power level for your cube, which is not true of my cube, which we're going to talk about in a second. So you have a lot more potential inclusions, which means you get to be pickier and just say, like, these are the ones that jump out at me, and sure, there's a bunch of other ones that would also fit, but I don't care. I'm not going to talk about them.
Yeah, I mean, for me, really, the highlight is the creature lands, because that is, like, more novel space. It's not just one removal spell versus another that have slight differences. This is like, I'm already playing just about every creature land, and I'm happy to get even more of them in there. Is it going to be too much? Maybe. We'll find out.
All right, next up is my Bun Magic cube. This is the only cube of mine that I have additions to from Wilds of Eldraine. The only other cubes I'm working on right now are the Degenerate Micro Cube, which there might be something here for the Degenerate Micro Cube. For a second, I looked at some of the virtues and was like, you could either show and tell the enchantment side or like have a whatever spell, but I don't think any of them get there. Maybe I'm missing something for it. The other cube I'm working on is my old Border Cube, which there's nothing in this set for that particular cube for obvious reasons. So really, it's just Bun Magic Cube. This is my high-power, low-curving, efficient, lean and mean, fair cube. It plays a lot like these kind of fair archetypes in Legacy. It's very low-curving. I yesterday was recounting the only 5 mana and more spells in the cube to somebody, and I think there's 4 of them or 5 of them. There's just very few things in the cube that cost a lot of mana. Like 4 mana is an expensive spell in this cube. There is a much higher bar of power level here. A lot of these cards in the set just are not going to matter. They would not be powerful enough to see play in a deck of this cube, so that's a consideration. I have a total of 17 cards here.
That's a lot of cards.
I know. This is a really good set, I think. I think this is a really deep set, and I think we're going to be coming back to cards from this set in 12 months that we overlooked and are going to be trying them again. I've got them in 3 groups. I have 3 cards I'm for sure putting in the cube for CubeCon, no question. These are like my rock-solid inclusions. I'll save those for the end. Then I have all the other cards broken out into 2 groups. One is the non-adventures, and the other is the adventures. There are 9 other adventure cards that I think are interesting enough that I would like to see how they play in this cube. But let's start with the non-adventure cards that are like on the cusp for me. The first is Werefox Bodyguard. This is 1 white for a 2/2 with flash. When it enters the battlefield, exile up to 1 target non-fox creature until Werefox Bodyguard leaves the battlefield. And it has 1 and a white, sacrifice Werefox Bodyguard, you gain 2 life.
Interesting. So historically, you've been really, really low on this type of cards.
I don't like Banisher Priest
type card.
I don't like Banisher Priest for a couple of reasons. One is that there's a bunch of cheap removal in my cube, so they are very often just lightning rods for that removal, and they essentially did nothing, but might have cost you a lot of tempo if they're removing your thing for less mana than you spent to cast it. I also just don't like that, like, essentially they're aggressive removal and that they're creatures that you can put in your deck that also remove your opponent's creatures, but you very often just can't afford to brawl with them because you can't afford to lose it in combat. I also don't enjoy Oblivion Rings either for kind of similar reasons. And for the Oblivion Rings, it's not obviously you can't brawl with them, it's that I don't like removal that can be easily undone because it can just be such a blowout at the wrong moment, and when 95% of the time your Oblivion Ring just says that thing's gone forever, you just start to shortcut it to that thing's gone forever, but now there's another game piece in play, and then every once in a while you just get blown out by forgetting that it's actually doesn't mean it's gone forever. They can actually interact with that.
Unless you bargain with the trigger on the stack.
For some of them that have the old rules formatting. Anyway, I think this is one of the best Banisher Priests we've seen. The only one I make an exception for is Skyclave Apparition, and that's because in my cube the cards are so powerful that essentially downgrading it to a creature token of power and toughness equal to the mana value of the card you exiled is a pretty big downgrade in almost every context.
That card feels so different from other Banisher Priest type cards, even though it looks very much like it on first read.
This one having flash, I think just makes it pretty appealing. It reminds me a little bit of Sigrid, the God Favored, which has a bunch of other more complicated rules text on it. This one I'm pretty low on, but I did note that like that's one of the better versions we've seen of this effect. I think it will play best when you flash it in on your opponent's end step to get rid of one of their blockers, and then you just swing for lethal, because it essentially got haste, and you also removed a thing when they didn't expect you to, when they were maybe tapped out and couldn't interact with it. So I noted that card.
What's up with this sacrifice ability? Obviously you can like blink your own things for
You can
5
protect your
mana,
own stuff
like that.
Which, protecting your own stuff with it, I think is a very reasonable use case. Like, in response to a removal spell, you just flash in this.
That's kind of cool because then you absolutely want to attack with it, and
exactly,
then
yeah.
Potentially later you can get that creature back. Okay, I'm into that.
Yeah, for all these reasons, I think this is much better than a regular Banisher Priest, and maybe people are giving it credit for. I think people are like, oh, this is another Banisher Priest, and I historically just don't look at the Banisher Priest for all the reasons I just mentioned, but this one did pique my interest a little bit. So, pretty low on it, but it's a thing. Another card that I'm very suspicious of, but also I did a double take at, is Sleep Cursed Faerie. It's 1 blue for a 3/3 with Flying Ward 2. Sounds pretty good so far.
Sounds good.
It also enters the battlefield tapped with 3 stun counters on it, and then has an ability 1 and a blue to untap Sleep Cursed Faerie. My biggest knock on this card is that I think people are going to read it wrong. Which is that they are going to think that, okay, it comes into play and doesn't untap during my untap step, but I can always just pay 1 and a blue to untap it. Except you can't.
That's not how stun counters
Stun counters say if it would untap, you just take a stun counter off. So you're basically, those first 3 times, you're just paying to remove a stun counter from it. This is a really interesting, it's a mana sink, and it's almost like a control card to me, where on turn 1, you can often just afford to do something else with your mana. You're not going to be holding up counter magic that often in the early turns of the game. And then you can, for the rest of the game, hold up counter magic, and if you don't have to counter something, you can untap your Sleep Curse Faerie, or take a stun counter off of it. And in the late game, it's essentially a Vigilant Flying Ward 2 3/3 that only costs you 1 mana. I think it's got some potential, but a little clunky. I'm also always looking at blue 1-drop creatures because, and this is like literally it's a blue 1-drop creature, but it's not really a blue 1-drop creature because it doesn't actually affect the board for quite a while after you've played it. It's almost got Suspend or something.
Yeah.
Anyway, I took a second look at that. Also not super high on that. These last 3 non-adventure cards I am more interested in. The first is Raging Battle Mouse. 1 and a red for a 2/1. The second spell you cast each turn costs 1 less to cast, and it has Celebration, so if 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn, it gets +1/+1 till end of turn. Double spelling is very easy in the Bun Magic Cube. The curve is super low, and if you imagine you're going to be double spelling most turns in the early game especially, this is essentially a 2-mana 3/2 that is also a mana dork. That just gives you 1 generic mana off your second spell you cast every turn. I will say that the curve is so low, there's not that many generic mana costs running around. So a lot of times you're like, okay, well, my 2 spells this turn are going to be Shock and something else that has no generic mana. I don't know.
Shock and Lightning Bolt.
Shock and Lightning Bolt. And so obviously the discount's not going to matter there. I don't quite know what to make of this. This one I definitely have to play with, and I definitely will put this into the cube eventually and test it. I don't think I'm going to put it in for CubeCon because I'm not sure if it's going to be just not good enough and kind of a liability and a waste of a slot. I gotta see.
Yeah, this card really jumped out to me as well. I feel like this is the kind of card that's going to lead to a lot of starts that are going to be very spooky. Your opponent's going to play this card and then do a thing on turn 3, and you're going to be like, wow, that was a lot.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's going to be a lot of mouse.
And in the Bun Magic Cube a lot, it's just going to die. It's a 2-mana card, they're just going to kill it, which is what happens to Dark Confidant and a bunch of other cards in the cube all the time, which is also totally fine. It's fine to have 2 drops your opponents have to answer. I will say, I'm trying not to spend too much time talking about all these cards, but I can't help it. A tiny quibble with this card is that it has 2 abilities that care about 2 things a turn, but there are 2 different things. Like, in my head, I want to shortcut it to your second spell costs 1 less to cast, and when you cast your second spell, it gets +1/+1 till end of turn. But the second thing is caring about non-land permanents entering the battlefield. So the fact that it cares about 2 different second things a turn is irksome to me.
I'm so sorry that happened to you.
All right, next up is the only card from Wilds of Eldraine Commander I'm interested in, and this is Loamcrafter Faun. 2 and a green for a 3/3 Satyr Druid. When it enters the battlefield, you may discard 1 or more land cards. When you do, return up to that many target non-land permanent cards from your graveyard to your hand. This is just a cool card with Life from the Loam, basically. I mean, that's the main use case for it. Is it does really cool stuff with Life from the Loam. It's right in the name, Loamcrafter Faun. I do run Life from the Loam, and I could see my way to trying this out, but I'm not excited about it enough or confident enough in how it will play to put it in before CubeCon. My last non-adventure card that is on the fence is the Huntsman's Redemption. This is 2 and a green for a Saga. On Chapter 1, it makes a 3/3 green beast creature token. A beautiful green beast creature token, I must say. The token itself is gorgeous. Chapter 2, you may sacrifice a creature. If you do, search your library for a creature or basic land card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle. I think the best way these first 2 chapters will play out is turn 1, you play a Mana Dork. Turn 2, you play the Huntsman's Redemption. You get a 3/3. Turn 3, you sacrifice your Mana Dork. Who needs that mana anymore? And you go get your next great creature on curve to keep curving out. Then chapter 3, up to 2 target creatures you control each get +2/+2 and gain trample until end of turn. So a little tiny overrun effect attached to it. This is a lot of value. This almost feels
a lot of value. I mean, similar to the adventures, it's like, oh, it's a 3-mana 3/3, but also it gives you this other ability which might be relevant, but also it gives you this other ability that might be relevant.
I don't think it's as good as Fable of the Mirror Breaker, but it gives me like Fable of the Mirror Breaker vibes a little bit in the fact that it's doing all of this different stuff.
Yeah, I could definitely see that being a similar space where a lot of people are like, oh, I'm interested in doing this like land synergy thing, and so I'll put this in here, but then it's just going to be a powerhouse.
Yeah, there's definitely a tension here, though. The reason this is not something I'm more excited about is that my cube does care about creature cards specifically. I've got Collected Company, which this doesn't work with. I've got things like Thalia, which tax all non-creature spells, which this is a nombo with. So it has some kind of like weird anti-synergies for what I normally want out of like my green 3-drops, which is something that works with those other cards. So I think it's cool. I like the decisions it offers you. I like trample. I've been trying to get a little more trample into my green section for the past few months, just noticing that over time I've slowly just been cutting trample cards for other reasons unrelated to their presence of trample, and just wanting to get a little more of that in there. So yeah, it's on my list of maybe tests, but it kind of doesn't fit perfectly with what the cube is doing overall. Then I have 9 adventure cards that are on the cusp for me.
That's a lot.
I don't think I'm going to read the rule text for all these, partially because of time. Like, these are all going to be in our show notes. We do provide a page that has a visual spoiler of all the cards we've mentioned in order. The 9 adventure cards I am interested in that are not solid inclusions are Virtue of Loyalty, Cheeky House Mouse, Scalding Viper, Elusive Otter, Horned Lockwhale, Kellen the Fey-Blooded, Questing Druid, Virtue of Courage, and Heartflame Duelist. So check out the visual spoiler if you want to see the rules text of any of these cards. Real quick, I think the ones that I am most interested in here are the Virtue of Loyalty, which is the 5-mana white virtue that... This is a great example of where like the adventure side of this card is just totally pushed. It's an instant that makes a 2/2 with Vigilance, and then draws you the other side of this card. Like, 2 mana...
2 mana, 2/2 draws you a card. That's a lot better than, I don't know, Elvish Visionary.
It's so much better. And the enchantment side of this puts a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control at the beginning of your end step, and untaps them.
That's insane.
It's insane. It's a lot of like power going on here. The question is like, obviously this card is, I think, good enough. It's really powerful. The question is, what decks does it fit in? And I do like my higher mana value cards to like clear some bar of coolness, right? And the question is like, is this enchantment side like cool enough to warrant inclusion, even though it's totally powerful enough? Similar kind of feelings about the red virtue. I think the enchantment side there is rarely going to matter in my cube, and so it's like, yeah, sure, it's fine. Like, it's a burn spell that draws you a card, and the card does anything, so like it's probably a fine spell, but how much is it actually going to matter? How many decks actually want it? I'm not sure. So those are the ones I'm interested in. I think people would expect me to be really excited about a card like Scalding Viper, and I was talking about this a little bit in the Discord earlier today. I think part of why I'm not thrilled about it is just because there are already so many blue-red spellslingery cards that I just love in my cube that I'm already like over the moon about, that this one, which is like fine, it like satisfies all of my requirements, it like meets all of my design criteria, but it's in a space that's already very full. My cup runneth over with blue-red cards that meet my criteria, so it's competing with a lot more stuff. In a kind of similar space, Elusive Otter, I just said I was looking for blue 1-drops. This is a fantastic blue 1-drop for the like aggressive Spellslinger decks, right? Like the decks that also have Monastery Swiftspear or Delver of Secrets or Soulscar Mage in them are going to love Elusive Otter. The fact that it's got this green spell stapled to it is just so odd. Like this would not really fit with any of the archetypes in my cube, except that it's a blue prowess creature that has some other evasion for 1 mana. Like that's the really powerful part here. The number of times you'd actually cast Grove's Bounty in my cube, probably not that often, so it's like, am I willing to have this kind of...
I mean, I think it's pretty easy in your environment, too. You know, you've already got a bunch of fetch lands, you pick up 1 breeding pool, and suddenly this becomes a thing that happens every once in a while.
But are you going to go out of your way to splash green in your, like, blue-red Delver deck because you might want to cast Grove's Bounty?
Yes.
I don't know.
I mean, if the cost is like, I got a late breeding pool pack 1, sure.
Yeah, the Teamer decks, I think, end up being much more mid-rangey in this deck. Like, if you're splashing green in your red-blue deck, you're probably doing it for Ren and 6 or Uro or something much more value-oriented. Whereas, like, the chances you can actually spend a pick on some fixing so you can maybe do your elusive otter thing, I think is much less. So anyway, that's that. I'm kind of excited about Questing Druid, the new Quirion Druid, but it's got the impulsive draw stapled to it. Heartflame Duelist is really cool, but I'm very wary of life gain. And this is life gain you actually have to work pretty hard for, and it's very easy to interact with. The Heartflame Duelist side is a 1 toughness creature that gives your instants and sorceries lifelink in white, so you'd have to be doing like white-red with a lot of burn spells, which is already a thing that doesn't happen that often in my cube, and then it's just a 1 toughness creature, which there are a million ways to kill that in my cube, so maybe going to try that out just because it's so easy to stop that life gain. And then the Horned Lockwhale was a card I was really excited about until I realized that the instant Lagoon Breach, which says the owner of target attacking creature you don't control puts it on top or bottom of their library, the owner gets to choose in that case. It's interesting because whether you choose or the player chooses is sometimes not, I think, obviously clear from like the English language reading of the rules text. But in this case, because you are just choosing a target creature, the opponent gets to choose. For example, like another card that might read similarly at first, but is actually not the same, is a card like Loaming Shaman, for example, is a card I misunderstood when I first started playing the game. It says when Loaming Shaman enters the battlefield, target player shuffles any number of target cards from their graveyard into their library. I thought the target player would get to choose the number of cards, but they don't because those cards are part of the target of the spell. You target the spells. Yeah. And even though your opponent is shuffling them into their library, it says your opponent shuffles into their library. You're not the one doing it. You still get to choose the targets. So anyway, the fact that your opponent gets to choose whether or not they're going to top or bottom that creature makes it a little less appealing to me, but it's a really cool control win condition that you can slot into a deck very easily. When your interactive spell that buys you time is also your win condition, that's a really cool space, I think, for control decks to play in. The last thing I'll say is tons of people are really excited about Cheeky House Mouse, and my little hot take for the day is I don't think it's as good as Fairy Godmother. So take that, everybody.
Wow.
All right.
But it's a cute little mouse. It gives it points.
It's very cute. Let's talk a little more about the 3 cards I'm really excited about including, because it's going to touch on themes from all the other cards, and I think it will say a little bit about what I'm looking for out of this set. The first card is Restless Vinestalk. This is the blue-green creature land from this set. It enters the battlefield taps for blue or green, and has 3 blue-green. Until end of turn, Restless Vinestalk becomes a 5/5 green and blue plant creature token with trample, still a land, and when it attacks, up to 1 other target creature has base power and toughness 3/3 till end of turn. Just the baseline stats, turning into a 5/5 trample for 5 mana, is quite good. Oftentimes we see that because of the low cost of inclusion of putting these like fixing lands in your deck, that the creature side is like not particularly aggressively costed. Like when you actually pay to activate the thing, you're getting a little bit of a below rate creature. I think a 5/5 trampler is great. I also really like that when it gets to the point in the game that you're activating it, you can't just be chump blocked indefinitely because the trample is really going to matter there. I really wanted to like Lair of the Hydra, the green Adventures in the Forgotten Realms creature land. It just becomes a larger and larger thing. You activate it for X and a green, it becomes that big of a creature to end of turn. But the lack of evasion means that they can just chump block it with literally anything, which I think really took that off the menu for me. And this has that advantage. I also think this trigger, making something base power and toughness 3/3 till end of turn, is quietly very powerful. You are sometimes going to get to pump your own stuff, and you're sometimes going to shrink your opponent's stuff. It doesn't have to be
target anything.
Doesn't have to be your creature, and so they might have a big blocker, and then oops, now it's just a 3/3, and I'm attacking you with a 5/5
that's really
and other
relevant.
stuff. So yeah, I think that trigger is the other thing that's really exciting about this, is that it gives you a lot of choice for how you want to use it. You can pump some dinky thing and make it relevant. You can pump something that, you know, it gets its power and toughness from like abilities or something.
Yeah, you did just cut Stonecoil Serpent, right? Because that would have been cool.
I did just cut Stonecoil Serpent. You could just kill their Death Shadow with it, probably.
Neat.
It's so anyway, it's I think it's a really cool creature land, and I also think blue-green is a color combination where I've wanted a really good creature land for a while.
You don't love Lumbering Falls?
No.
Fair.
Non-interactive, below-rate body, boring. This is so much more exciting than Lumbering Falls to me. It's not even close. All right, the second of 3 cards I'm really excited about including is Virtue of Persistence. This is the black Virtue. The adventure is 1 and a black for a sorcery, Target creature gets -3/-3 to end of turn, and you gain 2 life. And the enchantment is 5 black for Debtor's Knell, which is just an enchantment that says at the beginning of your upkeep, put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. This is exactly what I want my control decks to have access to as a win condition. It's a removal spell you just put in your deck, and then in the late game you just pay 7 mana and you start accruing untold card advantage over time. I think this is really cool. It's really flavorful. The showcase art is gorgeous on this card. I'm in love with it. Where the whale, for example, the removal spell on the whale is a little bit of a bummer because your opponent gets to choose. It has to be attacking, so you can't just remove a thing proactively. Kind of a bummer there. And then the other side of it is just a big dumb creature. And I've come around on my affection for big dumb creatures. I love my Tarmogoyf, my Murktide Regents as much as anybody else. But the Virtue of Persistence, the way that it's going to win the game, I think is going to be much more dynamic and interesting when it does actually get to happen. You get to take all of your opponent's best stuff you spend a bunch of time killing. I think it also fits better in a potentially green-black mid-range deck that has a little bit of ramp that you can actually get this out a little bit earlier. This card just sings for me. It's everything I wanted one of these virtues to be. And I don't like to complain about cards that we didn't get printed, which is a very common trope amongst Magic players. Is why didn't we get this? And it's well, why didn't we get anything? You can just say that about whatever you want. But I will say the last virtue revealed was the green virtue, and if there was a color to get a really cool modal card that was something cheap and relevant early, and then some big expensive enchantment payoff, the color I'd most want to get that was green. And the green one just is a giant ramp spell on the back end that not even Commander players are happy about because it only says basic lands tap for triple mana or whatever. So the fact that the black virtue, I think, was the first one revealed, if memory serves, and also my favorite, really into this one.
So I'll push back a little bit and just say, do you love when you don't have the tension of, do I want to put an expensive card in my deck? And instead it's just I just get this for free. There's no tension. I just love both halves of this. If it's early in the game, I get the removal spell I'm already happy with. If it's late, I get my win condition.
I'm really glad you said that because I think there is diminishing returns on it. I would not want all of my removal spells to also be late game win conditions. That would be awful. It's okay, well, I just cast the cards in my hand and I always have access to whatever I want all the time. And I think it's not that exciting. Right now, I have no removal spells that also double as win conditions, at least as far as I know. Maybe there's something in there floating
Lightning
around.
Bolt's a win condition.
Yeah, sure. So this is a new thing, right? Where I think one of these is really cool. I love this kind of effect more in Draft than I do in Constructed, because in Constructed, yeah, you just get to put however many of these in there you want. Here, it's do you want to favor this over a more efficient removal spell that doesn't have this back end on it? Which is, a 7-mana enchantment that doesn't affect the board the turn it comes down is, you have to be really late in the game. You really have to basically stop your entire opponent's strategy before it's going to matter for you. You don't want to risk anything by tapping out into this unless you already have a pretty solid control over the game. So yeah, I like that tension on this card. If we got more and more of these cards printed, there definitely would become a point where it's yes, I don't want below rate on both sides anymore for the flexibility, because I don't think that's inherently fun. I think it's just cool to have access to a couple of them in the cube.
Fair.
That brings me to the card I'm most excited about. It's Mosswood Dreadknight. This is the green-black gold adventure creature. The creature side is 1 and a green for a human knight with trample, and it's a 3/2. And when Mosswood Dreadknight dies, you may cast it from your graveyard as an adventure until the end of your next turn. So just on the front end, 2 mana for 3/2 trample. Great. Awesome. Beat down. Sounds awesome. I'm really excited to just have more good green 2-drops that attack well. I just said I wanted more trample. Here's more trample. I'm into it. And then the adventure side is just 1 and a black for a sorcery that says you draw a card and lose 1 life. I think this one's a little hard to value for some people because the golden rule for the original Eldraine adventure cards was the really good ones. The adventure curves right into the creature in a really powerful way. This is your Bonecrusher Giants, your Brazen Borrowers. You get to cast the adventure, then cast a creature of a turn after. It just is a perfect little curve out, just all in one card. That's what makes it powerful. And here, I think, first of all, it's not the case. You're paying 2 mana on turn 2 to draw a card and lose a life is not great, and then you don't want to only spend 2 of your available 3 mana on turn 3 to cast your 2-drop. But also here, I think this is way more powerful to just cast the creature first, then cast the adventure later.
That's a great point, because my first reaction to this card was just this card's insane. This just does so much. But in a cube like yours, when you play your 2-mana 3/2 on turn 2, what you don't want to be doing on turn 3 is casting your 2-mana spell. So, like, if you trade off of this next
they
turn,
just shock it. It's like, okay, well, now is it worth it for me to play off curve,
right,
to get the value out of my Mosswood Dreadknight and, like, keep the potential value engine going, or do I just ignore it and play my powerful 3-drop and just salute you, soldier, fallen 3/2 trample? So yeah, I'm really into this card. I love that it beats down. I love that it has the potential to be this like self-contained value engine, but at a pretty inefficient rate, especially in the Bun Magic cube. You know, this is going to trade down with so many 1-mana removal spells in the cube, just a whole giant pile of them. And then, yeah, it's going to pose some interesting sequencing conundrums for your opponent, where it's like, okay, now you have a choice. Is it worth to try and play to the late game, play for that value, play for the card advantage, or are you just going to curve out and play a broken 3-drop and then keep going on with your game plan? I think it's really elegant, and the once again, the promo is pretty cool looking, so I'm into that too. Those are the cards I'm most excited about adding to the Bun Magic Cube. This was anything but quick, but like I said, check out the show notes where we'll have visual spoilers of all the cards we mentioned. All those other adventures I am very much on the fence about, and if not for CubeCon coming up, I'd probably just dump them all in the cube, find some space for almost all of them, and play with them for a little while and see which one's stuck. Given the CubeCon's coming up, I'm going to have to limit myself, just stick to the cards I'm really confident about, and see where people land on some of these other cards. I want to see, as the community keeps playing with all these cards in everyone's cubes, what we all learn from playing with them and how their play patterns actually shake out.
Should we talk a little bit about the Turbo Cube?
It's turbo time.
So, my other cube that I've been actively maintaining lately is the Turbo Cube. This is a cube with special rules where all spells and activated abilities cost 2 generic mana less. So, you know, lots of weird, wacky stuff happens. Things are very cheap, and there's lots of eggs, which are rituals that draw you cards running around. There are a ton of cards in this set, actually, that I think would make a lot of sense here, but
I noticed quite a few.
There are 3 that I think are like really obvious good fits, and maybe I'll go back and look a little bit deeper in the future, but where I'm starting is just with 3. The first one is Collector's Vault. It's 2 mana for an artifact, and it has 2 mana, draw a card, discard a card, and create a treasure token. So in this context, it is just 0 mana to make a treasure token and loot, and games don't go on that many turns, so it will probably only be like 1 or 2 loots, but still it's basically like a Rummage plus a Moxen. It's going to be a good card. It's going to be like in not quite, I think, the top tier. The fact that it gives you a loot rather than drawing a card, like things like Guild Globe, makes it much worse, but I think it's also maybe a more interesting card where there's a lot of potential stuff you can do with that extra permanent it gives you and with the rummaging.
Yep, card's sick. Love
cool.
it.
Great. Next up, we got Surge Ginger, the Meal Ender.
Hell yeah.
2 generic mana for a 3/1, has trample and hexproof and haste as long as an opponent controls a planeswalker. That's probably not going to come up too much. There are a couple planeswalkers, but they're not super high picks. And whenever another artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put a 1/1 counter on Surge Ginger and scry 1. That ability is going to be extremely relevant and is potentially going to be just a massive creature. Again, you know, talk about stuff like the Collector's Vault that's going to be artifacts getting sacrificed. It also has the food ability. You can sacrifice it to gain life, actually in this case equal to its power, which that could be relevant as well.
Oh, you know someone's going to be saccifying this to gain enough life to dome their opponent with
with
Aetherflux Reservoir. That is going to happen.
That might happen. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of like cheap, aggressive cards in this environment. I think it's been kind of funny that the more combo-y things have been more powerful in this environment. So even things like Mirror Superior, which is just a free, a 4/5? Just like a big free creature, is actually not like a super high pick and isn't super relevant, but I think that this is like an aggressive free creature that you are going to want and has a lot of cool interactions.
Yeah, I think you really need the explosive ones. Mirror Superior, undercosted, but not that explosive. It's still going to take quite a few turns to deal a ton of damage to your opponent.
Right.
Meanwhile, Arcbound Ravager or
Yes.
Surge Ginger, these are cards that the next turn you could just kill them. You know, it's like that explosiveness, I think, is the thing that you need to key off on in the Turbo Cube more than just the overall rate.
And maybe they decided to put Oko in their deck, so maybe it'll get haste. Last up is Back for Seconds. This is 2 and a black for a sorcery with Bargain. Return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. If the spell is bargained, you may put one of those cards with mana value 4 or less onto the battlefield instead of your hand. Right now I have a similar sorcery that gets you back 2 creatures from the graveyard that also has cycling, and I feel like that's an easy swap. I think this is a lot more interesting. Cycling in this environment is free, so like there's a reason that card is there, but it just ends up being...
no one ever casts
people
it.
Just,
it's
people
just a
cycle
recycler.
it. So I think that this is actually just going to be a more interesting card, and the bargain's going to be relevant because there's lots of ways to make artifacts. In fact, there's lots of cases where sacrificing an artifact is going to be relevant.
I have wanted more ways to sacrifice the Wellsprings in this cube for a long time, So
yeah, I mean, this
into
isn't
that.
going to be like a standout. This isn't like busted like the other 2 cards we just talked about, but is going to be a fine role player, I think. Yeah,
and no 3 bowls of porridge for a little bit of the memes and a little bit of the it's actually okay.
we could do some porridge. I mean, I could just swap out, the Vial of Dragonfire, which is actually not that good, again, as like a free shock.
Yeah, isn't this just that but
fine.
better?
Let's throw in some
And you
porridge.
get to put 3 bowls of porridge in the turbo cube, which is just fun for everybody.
Bowls of porridge. All right, 4 cards.
Sick.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, whenever a new set comes out, I will explore the set with some degree for like things that cost 2, things that have activated abilities that cost 2 or 2 and 1 generic mana, and same with the mana cost. And there are just like a lot of things that would be fine, but not trying to make huge changes to this cube right now.
You should just acknowledge the existence of Scarecrow Guide and why you're not including it, because everyone's going to say it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there are already with things like Salvaged Mana Worker, things that do similar stuff.
Isn't that basically identical, just without reach, I think?
Yeah, it's very similar. I don't know. I like it. It would be good. Do we need more of this effect in this cube, though?
No, I know. You're preaching to the choir. I'm just saying that someone listening is like, what about Scarecrow Guide?
I mean, maybe I should just put it in. It doesn't, like, draw you cards, though. It just sort of sits there. Like, I'm much more excited about the Collector's Vault, which
It's just ramp.
also does this, like, deck manipulation.
Yes, Collector's Vault is much more exciting because it does that. Also, like, man, maybe there's a world where over a couple turns you build up treasure tokens with Collector's Vault and
Yeah,
aren't just immediately
absolutely.
using the mana. And it's possible.
It's possible.
The big power of Scarecrow Guide or Salvage Mana Worker, which is actually in the cube, is getting to make mana on both turns.
Right.
Your turn and your opponent's turn.
Which is cool. I would love to see games...
It's kind of like it is what Wall of Roots is, but for the turbo cube.
Yes.
where you can always use the mana basically, and the fact that you get to make it on both turns means that it's quite good.
I don't know. I'll put it on my maybe list here, and I'll think about it.
Yeah, I don't think you need both Scarecrow Guide and Salvage Mana Worker. They're basically identical cards.
Yeah.
If you go down that route, then the cube just becomes prescriptive and all those kinds of cards and nothing else.
True. So that's the Turbo Cube.
Turbo cube. I wasn't
It was a
yawning, I
real
swear.
enthusiastic turbo right there.
And that's Wilds of Eldraine. Do you want to close on any overall thoughts about the set, Anthony? I mean, I am thrilled for Adventures to return. I think the set, like I said, is very deep, and there'll be a lot of cards here that people will continue to be discovering. I'm excited to see the retrospective for this, which I guess won't be for like 4 years or whatever it actually gets out of standard. It's going to be forever.
Yeah.
Whenever this actually cycles out of standard, though, I'll be curious to see how this set is actually aged when we do our retrospective articles.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the big headlines are lots of cool and new types of enchantment stuff, which I think is going to be great for a lot of people. We got more creature lands, which I'm always excited for. And the adventures all seem busted.
They're pretty good, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I just think back to, on a very, very old episode of Drive to Work, Mark Rosewater talked about Splice to Arcane specifically, and how they had thought about making it splice onto any instant or sorcery, but the result was it would just, to balance them correctly, the cards would
It
have
would all
looked
be awful.
too anemic that people just wouldn't be excited about them. And I feel like with
Well, that's
Adventure...
a perfect example of, like, in order for those to matter in retail limited and not break legacy.
Oh, that's a great point, yeah.
Basically impossible needle to thread if you just said you could splice onto anything.
And I feel like they've just taken a really different approach with Adventure. I mean, maybe with Magic design in general, where they've just been like, yeah, these are just going to be reasonable cards that also do this other thing. It doesn't feel like that same, like, balancing has been done, which, you know, that's just where we're at.
I mean, I think they're the kind of Magic that Wizards has been pushing, right? They are, like, value-oriented. Like, games have just gotten bigger over time, I think. We have to acknowledge this. I know people are like, oh, you're always talking about big and small games. But it's true. These kinds of cards that just generate a lot of value are self-contained powerhouses, are more and more the kinds of cards we see printed, and we see less and less of the narrower build-arounds that have really high ceilings and really low floors and those kinds of risky cards, because why play risky cards? I mean, you can play Bone Crusher Giants and Scalding Vipers and whatever.
I mean, the virtues are really, really emblematic of that.
Yeah, I mean, just getting to put giant spells in your deck at the cost of a slightly less efficient removal spell definitely lets you have your cake and eat it too. Which, to your point, I think there is a limit to how fun that is in the long run, right? People had similar conversations around the modal double-face lands when we saw them at the first Zendikar Rising. In Zendikar Rising, they were like, oh, now I just get to put all these spells in my deck for, like, no cost. I get to, like, replace all these things. And the reality was tap lands actually was a bigger cost than people initially thought. It is kind of cool what those cards did to Constructed. There's a bunch of landless decks now that play, like, Charbelcher and stuff in Modern and Legacy that can afford to do that because all these cards are not lands in your deck, but they're lands that you can actually play. So, yeah, I don't know. I think I don't want to speculate how this is going to affect Constructed because I have no idea. I don't follow it closely enough to know, but I like having a couple of these Virtue-like cards in here to give my players the option to pursue that if they want, and I still have other things going on if you want to just pursue less of that value-oriented big game stuff. All right, that concludes this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. I got to get editing so we can get this out tomorrow morning to all of you beautiful sickos.
Wow, I'm going to go make some bread.
Bread. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. The show is produced by Anthony and I thinking really hard about
Thinking hard about microphones and talking to magic cards.
This show is produced by Anthony and I thinking really hard about magic cards and then speaking into microphones about it. Good setting. I think it's a good setting.
Yeah, seems cool.